December 16, 1944, dawned with a bitter frost across the German border town of Monschau, where Feldwebel-class Richter of the 12th SS Panzer Division scratched frantically across a frost-covered page in what would become one of the most chilling entries in Wehrmacht combat logs. His pencil trembled as he recorded words that defied everything he understood about warfare. The Americans possess a weapon that renders all defensive doctrine meaningless. Our soldiers are being slaughtered in their foxholes by artillery that explodes in the air above them. There exists no defense, no sanctuary. Death descends from the sky itself. Through the morning mist, Richter had witnessed the systematic annihilation of an entire battalion attempting to cross open ground near H.R. Fen. Not through direct impacts, those remained rare in artillery warfare. Not through conventional time, fused shells requiring precise calculations, but through something impossible. Shells that somehow determined exactly when to detonate, exploding 30 feet above his men's heads, sending lethal fragments downward in patterns no entrenchment could defend against. Within 3 minutes, 702 German soldiers lay dead. The few survivors who stumbled back through the snow existed in such psychological shock they could only repeat one phrase: Die Luft tät. The air kills. What Feldwebel Richter couldn't comprehend was that he had witnessed the combat debut of America's most closely guarded secret weapon in ground warfare. A device so revolutionary it would increase artillery effectiveness by 1,000%, save tens of thousands of Allied lives, and fundamentally alter warfare's nature forever. The proximity fuse, a miniature radar system compressed into an artillery shell, represented the world's first smart weapon, a thinking munition that would prove more decisive in winning the war than any other secret technology, except the atomic bomb itself. The mathematics of its impact would soon become undeniable. Where conventional shells required 500 rounds to destroy one enemy aircraft, proximity-fused shells needed only 155. Where traditional artillery killed soldiers hiding in trenches 5% of the time, proximity fuses achieved 70% casualty rates. Where London's survival against V-1 flying bombs seemed impossible, proximity fuses would destroy 79% of incoming missiles within 4 weeks. The story of this revolutionary weapon began not in America's laboratories, but during Britain's darkest hour, when survival itself seemed impossible. October 30, 1939, brought the first winter of war to Britain as young scientist W.S. Butemont submitted a proposal that would change warfare forever. Working at the Air Defense Establishment with colleagues Edward Shire and Ast Thompson, Butemont had conceived something resembling science fiction: an artillery shell that could think. The concept emerged from brutal mathematical reality. During the First World War, anti-aircraft gunners had fired an average of 500 shells for each enemy aircraft destroyed. By 1939, with planes flying faster and higher, the ratio had worsened dramatically. Britain's survival in the coming air war would depend on improving these odds. Butemont's solution involved radio waves that would detect approaching aircraft and detonate shells automatically at optimal distance. He faced a problem that seemed insurmountable with 1939 technology. His radio fuse would need to survive being fired from a gun at forces exceeding 20,000 times normal gravity, spin at 30,000 revolutions per minute, operate in temperatures from -50 to +100 degrees Fahrenheit, and still maintain sensitivity to detect aircraft 70 feet away. British scientists constructed prototypes by June 1940, testing them in unrotated projectiles, essentially rockets, against balloon targets. The tests proved the concept viable, but revealed the crushing technological challenge. No existing electronic components could survive the violence of being fired from a gun. The solution would arrive from across the Atlantic, delivered during Britain's most desperate hour by one of history's most important scientific missions. September 6, 1940, saw the Canadian Pacific liner Duchess of Richmond arrive in Halifax, Nova Scotia, carrying cargo more valuable than gold. Sir Henry Tizard and a black metal deed box containing every major British military secret. The Tizard mission, as history would remember it, represented an unprecedented gamble, a nation fighting for survival, sharing its most closely guarded military technologies with a country not yet at war. The delegation assembled in Washington on September 12th, taking residence at the Wardman Park Hotel. For a week, they revealed Britain's technological treasures, radar systems, jet engine designs, explosive technologies, and chemical weapons research. But on September 19th, in a conference room overlooking Connecticut Avenue, British physicist Dr. John Cockcroft presented something special to a young American physicist summoned specifically for this meeting. Dr. Merle Tuve, 39 years old, sat transfixed as Cockcroft explained British proximity fuse research. Tuve, raised in rural South Dakota, had spent his childhood tinkering with radio sets alongside his friend Ernest Lawrence, who would later win the Nobel Prize. Just 1 month earlier, August 1940, Vannevar Bush had appointed Tuve to lead a new secret section of the National Defense Research Committee, Section T, created specifically to develop proximity fuses. Tuve's appointment hadn't been random. Earlier that summer, he had been listening to radio reports of the London Blitz with his wife, Winnie. The broadcaster described children being pulled from rubble, entire neighborhoods eliminated in minutes, the desperate inadequacy of British air defenses. Tuve had turned to his wife with tears in his eyes. "We have to find a way to stop those bombers. Technology has to provide the answer." Now, in that Washington conference room, Cockcroft was handing him exactly that opportunity. The British concept, while brilliant, remained theoretical. No one had solved the fundamental problem of making vacuum tubes and electronic circuits that could survive being shot from a gun. Cockcroft was honest about British limitations. They lacked the industrial capacity and resources to pursue the massive development program required. America, with its vast industrial base and protected geography, represented the only hope. Tuve left the meeting with a mission that would consume the next 5 years of his life and mobilize the entire American electronics industry. The challenge seemed impossible. The solution would require innovations that didn't yet exist, manufacturing techniques never before attempted, and a scale of production that defied comprehension. By December 1940, the mansion at 5241 Broad Branch Road had been transformed into the nerve center of America's most secret weapons program. Tuve had assembled a team that would reshape warfare. Richard B. Roberts, a nuclear physicist who had worked with Niels Bohr, Henry H. Porter, an expert in acoustics, Robert B. Broad, who had studied cosmic rays, Lawrence Hafstad, a specialist in nuclear physics, Lloyd Berkner, a pioneer in ionospheric research, and a 26-year-old physicist named James Van Allen, whose later discovery of Earth's radiation belts would make him famous, but whose wartime contribution would remain classified for decades. The challenge they faced defied every assumption about electronics. A proximity fuse would need to be a complete radar system. Transmitter, receiver, amplifier, and detonator, compressed into a space smaller than a coffee can. It would need to generate radio waves, detect their reflection from targets, process the signal, and trigger detonation, all while experiencing forces that would destroy any conventional electronic device. Van Allen took on the most fundamental challenge, creating vacuum tubes that could survive being fired from a gun. Traditional vacuum tubes with their delicate glass envelopes and fragile filaments shattered at forces of just 100 times gravity. The proximity fuse would need to survive acceleration 200 times greater. For 6 months, Van Allen worked with a Massachusetts hearing aid company, Raytheon, developing miniaturized tubes with revolutionary construction. Instead of hanging filaments from delicate wires, they created rigid structures using techniques borrowed from hearing aid manufacturing. The breakthrough came in January 1942 with Van Allen's Mustrap Spring. Innovation: a mechanical system that protected tube filaments during the massive acceleration of firing, then released them for normal operation during flight. Lloyd Berkner achieved another crucial breakthrough in December 1940, developing a circuit design that used separate transmitter and receiver functions, significantly advancing beyond the British Autodyne concept. His innovation allowed the fuse to detect targets at greater distances with higher reliability, essential for effective combat performance. By March 1942, the project had outgrown Carnegie's facilities. Johns Hopkins University established the Applied Physics Laboratory in an abandoned Chevrolet dealership at 86291 Georgia Avenue in Silver Spring, Maryland. The building still smelled of motor oil and rubber when the first scientists arrived, but within weeks it housed the most advanced electronics laboratory in the world. Merle Tuve became APL's first director, establishing a laboratory culture that would define American weapons development for decades. Signs appeared on every wall. "I don't want any damn fool in this laboratory to save money. I only want him to save time." Another read: "Our moral responsibility goes all the way to the final battle use of this unit. Its failure, there is our failure here." The technical specifications of what they achieved still seem impossible even by today's standards. The proximity fuse operated as a continuous wave radar system transmitting at 180 to 220 MHz, frequencies that in 1940 were considered the cut-edge of radio technology. The projectile's metal shell body served as the transmitting antenna, excited by a small conical antenna in the nose. The entire system employed an Autodyne configuration where a single oscillator tube functioned as both transmitter and receiver, an elegance of design born from brutal space constraints. Inside a space barely 5 inches long and 2 inches in diameter, they packed 4 miniaturized vacuum tubes, 130 electronic components, a wet cell battery, safety mechanisms, and the detonator system. The oscillator tube generated a 70 MHz signal with harmonics at 180 to 220 MHz. When these radio waves bounced off approaching targets, they created interference patterns that varied the oscillator loading, producing beat frequencies in the 200 to 800 Hz range. The power source represented another, seemingly impossible innovation. Traditional batteries couldn't survive the G-forces or provide sufficient power in such a small space. The solution came from National Carbon Company, which developed a revolutionary reserve battery using liquid electrolyte stored in a glass ampule. The firing shock would shatter the ampule, and centrifugal force from the shell's spin would drive the electrolyte into stacked carbon and zinc plates, activating the battery during flight. Safety systems prevented premature detonation through multiple mechanisms. Centrifugal switches remained open until the shell reached proper spin rate, a 0.5 to 0.7 second arming delay after firing prevented detonation near friendly forces. The sensitivity increased gradually during flight, reaching maximum effectiveness at typical engagement ranges. January 5, 1943. Began at 0800 hours in the southwest Pacific near Guadalcanal as USS Helena's radar detected incoming aircraft. 4 HED-3A Val dive bombers approaching at 12,000 feet. Lieutenant Russell, Red Cochran, commanding the aft 5-inch battery, had been briefed on the new ammunition just days before. In the magazine below, gunners loaded shells marked with special green bands, the Navy's indication of proximity, fused rounds. Range 8,000 yards and closing, called the rangefinder operator. Cochran watched the approaching planes through his binoculars. In conventional combat, his guns would need direct hits, nearly impossible against maneuvering aircraft. But these shells were different. They only needed to pass within 70 feet of the target. Commence firing. The first salvo erupted from Helena's guns, shells tracing red arcs across the morning sky, passing near the lead valve. Nothing happened. They were still too distant. The second salvo followed 15 seconds later. At 5,000 yards from Helena, 11,000 feet altitude, one shell passed approximately 60 feet from the lead bomber. The explosion looked different from anything Cochrane had seen before. Instead of the shell continuing past the plane or exploding on impact, it detonated in midair, sending a perfect sphere of fragments outward. The valve's wing sheared off instantly. The engine, peppered with hundreds of steel fragments, burst into flames. The aircraft didn't break apart dramatically. It simply ceased flying, transforming from a controlled dive bomber into a tumbling mass of burning aluminum. Splash 1. Called the spotter. In the radio room, the combat report was already being encoded. Enemy aircraft engaged with special ammunition. 2 confirmed destroyed. Ammunition performance exceeded all expectations. What the report didn't capture was the psychological impact on Helena's crew. Gunner's mate First Class Anthony Poole later recalled, "We couldn't believe it. For months, we'd fired thousands of rounds at planes, maybe hitting one if we were lucky. Now we were knocking them down with just a few shots. It was like God himself was guiding our shells." The impact rippled through the Pacific Fleet with stunning speed. Even before Helena's combat debut, USS Cleveland had conducted the test that convinced the Navy to stake everything on this new technology. In Chesapeake Bay, the cruiser faced 3 radio-controlled drone aircraft, sophisticated targets that could perform evasive maneuvers. The test was scheduled for 2 days. It lasted less than 2 hours. First drone destroyed with the second burst of proximity, fused shells. Second drone eliminated on the 4th burst. Third drone obliterated on the 1st burst. The Navy observers were so shocked they cancelled the remaining tests and immediately ordered mass production. Admiral William Spike Blandy, watching from Cleveland's bridge, turned to his aide. "This changes everything. Every ship in the Pacific needs these rounds immediately." By spring 1943, proximity fuses were flowing to the Pacific in extraordinary quantities. The first 5,000 rounds went to U.S. Enterprise, USS Saratoga, and USS Helena under the personal supervision of Commander W.S. Parsons, the same officer who would later arm the atomic bomb aboard Enola Gay. Security was absolute. The shells were stored in special magazines with armed guards. Only gunnery officers were briefed on their capabilities. Crew members were told they were special incendiary rounds to explain their different appearance. The statistics from 1943 revealed the transformation. Although proximity fuses comprised only 25% of anti-aircraft ammunition fired, they accounted for 51% of all Japanese aircraft destroyed by naval gunfire. The rounds per kill ratio dropped from 5.58 for conventional time fused shells to just 1.55 for proximity fused ammunition. A 3-fold improvement that would only increase as crews gained experience. June 19, 1944, brought the ultimate test as Lieutenant James Van Allen stood on the flag bridge of USS Washington, watching radar screens fill with approaching contacts. The same James Van Allen who had developed the shock-proof vacuum tubes now witnessed his invention's ultimate test. The Japanese had launched their entire carrier aviation strength, 423 aircraft, in a desperate attempt to destroy the American fleet supporting the Marianas invasion. Van Allen had been commissioned in November 1942 and spent 16 months training gunnery officers throughout the Pacific Fleet. He knew every ship was loaded with proximity-fused ammunition. He knew the theoretical effectiveness, but theory and combat were different things. Raid 1 bearing due 65. Angels 2069 aircraft, announced the Combat Information Center. Admiral Mark Mitcher ordered, launch all fighters. Gun crews to battle stations. As Hellcat fighters tore into the Japanese formations, those that broke through faced a wall of proximity, fused anti-aircraft fire unlike anything in naval history. Van Allen watched from Washington's bridge as the sky filled with black puffs, each one representing a proximity-fused detonation. Japanese planes began falling like rain. A Zero fighter dove on USS South Dakota, 1,000 yards from Washington. Van Allen watched South Dakota's 5-inch guns track smoothly, firing measured bursts. The third shell detonated 50 feet from the Zero. The plane didn't explode, it simply came apart. Wings separating from fuselage, engine falling free, the pilot's body tumbling through space. It was systematic slaughter. Van Allen would later write to his wife. The proximity fuses turned our ships into fortresses. The Japanese pilots were brave. They kept coming even as their squadrons were annihilated. But courage couldn't overcome technology. By day's end, the Japanese had lost 315 carrier aircraft plus 50 land-based planes. American losses 29 aircraft, mostly from operational accidents. The one-sided nature of the battle effectively ended Japanese carrier aviation. They would never again launch a conventional carrier strike. The proximity fuse's tactical accomplishments were revolutionary, but its psychological impact proved equally significant. For German forces facing this new weapon at the Battle of the Bulge, traditional defensive doctrine became meaningless overnight. Soldiers who had survived years of conventional artillery bombardment found themselves helpless against shells that exploded at predetermined heights, sending fragments downward into any foxhole or trench. The industrial achievement behind proximity fuse production represented one of the greatest manufacturing miracles in history. By late 1942, the challenge seemed insurmountable. Each proximity fuse required 130 precision components that had never been mass-produced before. The miniature vacuum tubes alone required tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The entire assembly had to be perfect. A single failed component meant a dud shell that might kill American soldiers instead of the enemy. The mobilization began with Crosley Corporation in Cincinnati. Powell Crosley Jr., who had made his fortune selling radios and refrigerators, converted his entire facility to proximity fuse production. By January 1943, the assembly lines were operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Betty Morrison, an assembly line worker at Crosley from 1943 to 1945, recalled in a 1995 interview, "We didn't know what we were making. Security was unbelievable. We were searched entering and leaving. No purses, no bags, nothing. We sat at benches 8 hours a day, soldering tiny components onto circuit boards. The supervisors told us we were making radio parts for aircraft. Only after the war did we learn we'd been building the proximity fuses that saved so many of our boys." The numbers escalated at rates that defied comprehension. December 1944 100 units daily, June 1943 1,003 daily, December 1943 40,000 daily. By spring 1944, American factories were producing 70,000 proximity fuses every single day, more than Germany's entire monthly production of conventional fuses. The proximity fuse program's security rivaled that of the Manhattan Project, and for good reason. If Germany or Japan had captured and reproduced the technology, the Allied advantage would have vanished overnight. Captain S.R. Shoemaker of the Naval Bureau of Ordnance invented the deliberately misleading name, variable time fuse, specifically to cloak the device's significance. Workers in factories were told they were making radio components or electronic parts for aircraft. The close calls were numerous and terrifying. In July 1943, a dud proximity fused shell fired from a destroyer landed on a beach in Sicily. Headquarters immediately dispatched a special recovery team by air to retrieve it before German forces could find it. They succeeded, but the incident led to new regulations restricting proximity fuse use over land until the Battle of the Bulge. In December 1944, the ultimate security nightmare occurred. During the German offensive in the Ardennes, Wehrmacht forces overran an American ammunition dump containing 20,000 proximity fuses. If German scientists had recognized what they captured, they could have potentially developed countermeasures or copied the technology. Incredibly, German engineers examined the captured fuses and concluded they were impossible. A post-war interrogation of Dr. Hans Geiger, leading German fuse expert, revealed their thinking. We examined American fuses captured in the Ardennes. We concluded they could not function as claimed. No vacuum tube could survive the acceleration forces. The Americans were attempting to deceive us with propaganda about superweapons. The Germans had the proximity fuse in their hands and didn't believe it could work. Testimony to how far American technology had leaped. The proximity fuse's impact extended far beyond its immediate tactical effects. It demonstrated that technological superiority could provide decisive military advantage. It proved that democratic nations mobilizing civilian science and industry could out-innovate totalitarian regimes. Most importantly, it introduced the age of smart weapons, munitions that could think for themselves and make decisions without human intervention. Behind every proximity fuse lay human stories of innovation, sacrifice, and determination. Merle Tuve never recovered from the war's intensity. Colleagues found him in 1946 sitting alone in his empty laboratory at Johns Hopkins, weeping. All those boys who died while we were still developing the fuse. He said, if we'd been faster, even by weeks, how many would have lived? The women who assembled proximity fuses. Betty Morrison at Crosley, Marie Collins at Johns Hopkins. Thousands of others whose names are lost, carried their Secret Service quietly. Most never knew what they built until decades later, if at all. Their nimble fingers and patient precision saved countless lives half a world away. Military historians consistently rank the proximity fuse among World War II's 3 most decisive technologies, alongside radar and atomic weapons. But unlike the atomic bomb used only twice, proximity fuses saw continuous combat use from January 1943 through August 1945, affecting thousands of engagements. The statistics support this assessment. An estimated 25,000 enemy aircraft destroyed or damaged by proximity fuses, over 5,000 V-1 flying bombs destroyed, tens of thousands of enemy soldiers killed by proximity fused artillery. Allied lives saved numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Admiral Chester Nimitz provided perhaps the best assessment. The proximity fuse was worth 10 divisions of infantry, 100 squadrons of aircraft, an entire fleet of ships. It was force multiplication through technology, the American way of war. 2 weeks after that first devastating use at Monschau, as 1944 turned to 1945, Feldwebel-Class Richter made his final diary entry. The Battle of the Bulge was failing. German forces were in retreat. American proximity fused artillery continued its relentless thunder, each air burst illuminating the snow-covered battlefield with deadly efficiency. We face not just American soldiers, but American science. Their shells think, they calculate, they decide when to kill. We are fighting the future itself, and the future is winning. God help Germany, for we have awakened a giant whose weapons are guided by intelligence itself. Richter couldn't know how right he was. The proximity fuse represented more than just superior technology. It embodied the advantage of free societies, mobilizing civilian expertise for military purposes. While German scientists competed in isolation and Japanese researchers worked in ignorance, American scientists, British physicists, and Canadian engineers collaborated openly, sharing discoveries and solving problems collectively. The proximity fuse was democracy's weapon, created by free people, manufactured by free workers, employed by free soldiers defending freedom itself. Its development required not just technical skill but trust between allies, sharing secrets, between government and universities, between military and civilian sectors. That trust, impossible in totalitarian regimes, provided the decisive advantage, from Buteman's October 1939 concept to mass production by 1943. The proximity fuse traveled from British desperation through American innovation to Allied victory. Along the way, it saved hundreds of thousands of lives, shortened the war by months if not years, and introduced the age of intelligent weapons that continues today. The proximity fuse proved that wars could be won not just through courage and sacrifice, but through superior technology and industrial might. It demonstrated that thinking weapons could multiply force beyond anything previously imagined. Most importantly, it showed that free nations pooling their intellectual and industrial resources could achieve miracles that totalitarian states could only dream about. In those vacuum tubes that James Van Allen taught to survive impossible forces, in those circuits that Lloyd Berkner designed to detect approaching death, in those assemblies that countless unnamed women soldered with perfect precision, lay the margin between victory and defeat, between freedom and tyranny, between the world we inherited and one too terrible to contemplate. The proximity fuse was indeed the most effective secret weapon of the war, not because it was the most powerful, but because it was used everywhere, continuously, decisively. It was the weapon that thought, and in thinking, it helped thinking people preserve their freedom to think.